In this courtroom, the courtroom of Judge John Kingfield in the small town of Belvedere, New Jersey, two lawyers are preparing for battle. At issue, exactly what happened on the night of February 26, 1989. Daniel Bias says he came home from a shooting range that night and he had an argument with Lise. He says she got upset and threatened him with one of his own loaded guns he kept around the house. And he says she then went upstairs and put that gun to her head. He says when he tried to take it away, the trigger went off.
That the bullet that entered the left side of his wife's head enters 2.5 inches behind the left ear. The bullet entered back here. The defendant says the decedent was holding the gun here.
You may call your first witness.
Officer Thomas Walsh.
Prosecutor Bob Russell's first witness.
Yes, I did.
The police officer who responded to the call that night.
He stated that he returned home approximately an hour before the call, and he had an argument with the victim. He stated that he was watching TV when the victim came downstairs with a weapon and stated, "It's times like this that people kill themselves." He told the victim to go back upstairs, put the weapon away. Approximately 2 minutes later, he went upstairs, opened the door, saw the victim pull the trigger.
Detective John Flynn was the investigator on duty that night. His testimony allows the jury to get their first pictures of Lise Bias.
This is the photograph showing the body of Lise Bias, the upper portion of her body, along with this gun underneath her right arm.
And Flynn confirms for the prosecution that Bias changed his story.
And we wanted to talk to him further about what happened when he arrived home that night, and to take a detailed statement from him. At that point, he made a statement to me saying, "I know I said that my wife shot herself when I opened the bedroom door." And I said to him, "I know that. We'll be going into that." And he made a statement to me, "I guess I should tell you, maybe I shouldn't have tried to grab the gun." And when he said that to me, I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, when I entered the bedroom and saw her with the gun to her head, I ran and grabbed for the gun and it went off."
The videotaped statement Bias gave in the early morning hours of February 27th, 1989.
My wife and I had a little bit of an argument. Pretty much calmed down. And the argument was about that she wanted to tell me about a piece of jewelry she saw back in my car. I said, "Well," I said, "you have enough jewelry, and I really don't want to care about it right now." So she got a little mad. Just arguing just a little bit. So I was watching TV and I walked downstairs. She pointed the gun at me and she says, "You know, you just got done watching that show. See how easy somebody can shoot somebody? I thought he just shot you and I didn't thought nothing of it." So I told her, "You know, stop playing around. Just take that and put it back upstairs." She went upstairs. I waited a minute or two and I went upstairs. She was standing by the end of the bed and she had a gun up against her head. And I said, "Hey, come on, that's enough. Let's stop playing around." And I told the other officer, that's when she shot herself. But the gun went off when I tried to take it away from her. When it went off, it was like everything was in slow motion. She didn't move. A couple of months ago, she pulled the gun on me. I had to have the Goldsboro police come to the house. And then she was going to shoot herself. I took the gun away. They took her to the hospital and they talked to her for a couple hours and then they let her go.
Did you have the gun loaded?
The gun was always loaded. There was never a full cylinder in gun. She knew that. She knew very well how to use the gun.
I'm still a little confused about something. If she's holding it in her left hand to her head, she falls forward and sideways. How did that weapon wind up?
I don't know. When she fell, she got hit the end of the dresser and then slid. And when she slid, her body was just going all different ways. I don't know how it got.
Do you know if you had your finger on the trigger?
I definitely did not have my finger on the trigger. Definitely did not.
How can you say definitely not?
Because her hand, I had my hand on her hand, and pretty much covering the top of the grip when I started to try and take the gun. There's no way my hand hit that trigger. You guys make me feel I shot my wife. And I would never do that or try to do that. And now you're making it sound like I did it accidentally.
You were in charge of that investigation on that evening, correct?
Yes.
And you took charge of the gun that's been marked S16 in evidence, correct?
Yes, I did.
Did you at any time on that evening or subsequent to that evening do any fingerprint testing on that gun?
No.
So it's fair to say that we cannot now know whether the fingerprints of Lise Bias might have been on that gun?
Not now, no.
Now, there are tests available to test whether or not an individual has fired a weapon, correct?
Yes.
In other words, you can do tests of someone's hands to determine whether there's any residue left there from the firing of the weapon.
Well, there's one that I know of. I don't know of tests. More that there's one I heard of.
Now, Mr. Bias was with you for that entire evening, correct?
Correct.
Did you ever have any such test performed on him that evening?
No.
And had you had that test performed, do you think that the result might be helpful to us in this trial?
Judge, I have to interpose an objection at this point.
This witness, the man who did Lee Bias's autopsy, Warren County Coroner Isidore Mahalakas.
I'm going to ask you whether or not you recognize what's contained in that envelope.
Yes, I do recognize it.
And what do you recognize it to be, and how do you recognize it?
This is the hair that I clipped from Ms. Bias and surrendered to the police.
Did you wash this hair before you surrendered it to the police?
No, I did not.
Why not?
Because washing the hair washes what I want the police to examine.
And what is it that you want the police to examine for?
I want them to examine for gunshot residue.
Okay. What is gunshot residue?
Gunshot residue is a sum total of all the contents that come out of the muzzle at the time that a gun is fired.
Do you have an opinion, doctor, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to how far the muzzle of that weapon was from the head of Lisa Bias when it was fired?
Yes, sir, I do.
What is your opinion, doctor?
The range of fire was distant, beyond the range of self-infliction.
Now, how did you come to that opinion, doctor?
That opinion was arrived at by the absence of any deposits on the scalp surface. Self-infliction refers to the muzzle to target distance. We know that Ms. Bias had an arm reach from the axilla to the tip of the index finger of 23.5 inches, with the finger in the trigger, the index finger in the trigger. It is impossible to hold it at a sufficient length that it would not result in some deposition.
Deposition of what, doctor?
Gunshot residue, Mr. Russell.
I would refer you to page 4 of your autopsy report. You have that in front of you, do you not? And that indicates that you performed gentle rinsing, does it not, sir?
Well, I think we just cannot take the words gentle rinsing out of context.
Does your report on page 4 indicate that at the time you clipped the hair, you performed gentle rinsing?
I admit the words gentle rinsing are in the report. This I will grant you. However, they are taken out of context and potentially misleading in that the sequence that it occurred is not addressed.
Dr. Mahalakas, you're aware that Mr. Bias contends that the gun went off when he was attempting to disarm his wife.
Yes, ma'am, I'm aware of that.
And you're aware that Mr. Bias says that he put his hand over his wife's hand and he pulled on her arm, correct?
That is correct.
And is it not possible that the pulling on her arm would cause her head to go to the left and would result in the wound track that you're talking about? I'm not talking about distance now. I'm talking about direction.
Quite frankly, no. Primarily because if he's pulling, then we should end up with an upward shot. And we have essentially a horizontal shot.
But if he pulls and her head moves, we could end up with that wound track, could we not, Doctor?
Well, that in part, that's correct, Mrs. Smith.
Okay, that's the answer to my question, Doctor. If he
Well,
pulls...
yes, it's not the answer to your question because I said...
Yes, sir, it is. Thank you.
The prosecutor calls on a series of other experts.
Can you tell this jury whether or not there is any way in which that gun would have fired had the trigger not been pulled?
No.
Do you have an opinion, sir, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, that if a weapon is held parallel to a left shoulder, that is, the gun is being held in the left hand, and if that weapon is discharged in close proximity to the head, whether or not you would have found gunshot residue on the hair and on the garment worn by the shooter at that time?
You most definitely would have found gunshot residue on the target surface. That would have been the head and the hair.
Did you find any evidence whatsoever of any gunpowder on any of those slides that you examined?
No.
Tell me what that is a photograph of.
Myself on a tractor towing an airplane, and the tool shed my daughter and I were building.
Now, your daughter, Chester, was left-handed or right-handed?
Right hand.
defense attorney Elizabeth Smith calls a medical professional who treated Lise Bias when she was brought to Warren County Hospital 2 years earlier.
She told me that there was an argument tonight with her husband, and she became angry and threatened to shoot herself with her husband's gun. She says that these arguments happen about twice a year. She said that she was no longer feeling suicidal. Mr. Bias agreed that arguments were infrequent, but have led to these suicidal thoughts.
Hi, this is Daniel Bias from 259 Chambers Street. My wife just shot herself.
Elizabeth Smith plays the recording of the call Dan Bias made to police the night of his wife's death.
Jesus Christ. Stop for 259 Chambers Street, right away. Oh my God. She shot herself. Where did she shoot herself? In the head? Oh God. All right, just stand by, okay? They're on the way, all right?
Dr. Lewis Rowe, Chief Medical Examiner for Westchester County, New York.
In this situation, that the hair around the entrance wound was removed, and it was rinsed. According to the record, that it was rinsed and then examined, I guess, to remove the blood staining on the hair. The action of washing certainly will remove the gunpowder adherent to the surface of the hair.
Are you able, based upon your review of the materials in this case, Dr. Rowe, to formulate an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty as to the muzzle to target distance in this particular case?
Yes.
And what would your opinion be based on, Doctor?
In this case, according to the record, there was no powder stippling seen around the entrance wound, although the gunpowder was found in the bullet track. So we're talking about the distance beyond the 4 inches, and yet it has to be close to have this gunpowder reach through the bullet track. So it was my estimation that it's about 6 to 8 inches.
Dr. Lewis Rowe then demonstrates with the defense attorney how he thinks the event that night could have happened.
This is the way usually people place the gun. Now, according to the statement that her hand was grabbed and pushed away like that, creating the distance.
Well, I'll tell you what, why don't you snap and pull and let her pull the trigger at the same time? She can't pull that trigger.
So if I snap it...
No, please, don't touch it with your right hand. You can't do that. And you have to be over on this side, though. You have to be from the left.
If I yank it this way, and this way.
Now, on that particular, the evening that Lise died, thinking back on it, did you observe anything unusual about her that night?
For the last couple nights before then, she was very, very clingy. Normally, it was normal procedure. Lisa would normally go to bed probably an hour and a half before I would. I would normally do things after she would go to bed, and then I would go to bed afterwards. And she demanded that Friday and that Saturday that I went to bed when she went to bed immediately. And she had never been like that before.
When you went on that evening to take the gun from Lise, what was in your mind?
That she was doing it for attention, but when she didn't acknowledge me when I walked into the room, then I got a little bit more concerned.
And is that when you attempted to take the gun?
Yes, it is.
Is that when the gun went off?
Yes, it is.
Nothing further.
Listen to the question, Mr. Bias. Did Patrolman Walsh testify truthfully when he said that you told him that your wife came downstairs with a .357 Magnum and said, quote, "It's times like this that people kill themselves"?
That's incorrect. That is not what I said.
So he was not testifying truthfully?
I'm not saying that he wasn't testifying to what he thought I said. That is not what I said.
And isn't it a fact, Mr. Bias, that as this argument escalated, you began to lose your patience?
No.
And that you pulled out the gun from under the bed where you had kept loaded. And at that time, Mr. Bias, your wife, she was by the mirror, Mr. Bias.
Absolutely not. What you're saying is not true.
She wasn't by the mirror?
No, what you're saying about me pulling the gun out from underneath the bed.
She was by the mirror, isn't that right, Mr. Bias? And she was walking out the door.
Absolutely
because
not.
She told you, Mr. Bias, that she had it. She wanted a divorce.
No, she did not.
You were talking about divorce, weren't you?
Absolutely not.
Didn't you talk about divorce about a month or two before this incident?
We had talked about possibilities of it, I would say, September, October. That's like 4 months, 5 months?
About divorce.
Yes.
And she told you, Mr. Bias, that she was no longer going to have your baby, didn't she?
You're dreaming, pal.
I'm dreaming.
That's right.
Am I dreaming, Mr. Bias, that at that point you picked up this gun, you pointed at her, and you pulled the trigger? And at that point, Mr. Bias, she fell to the left, down against that heater. And at that point, you panicked.
No way. I did not shoot my wife.
Mr. Bias, at the time of Lisa's death, did you love your wife?
Absolutely.
Were you discussing divorcing her?
No, we were discussing having a baby.
Was anything that the prosecutor said to you about his version of the incidents that night true?
No.
The state must prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that Daniel Bias knowingly or purposely killed his wife. And they must prove that based on facts. And I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that in order to come to that conclusion, you would have to eliminate every possibility of an accidental shooting in this case. We all like to hope that if we tell the truth, that it will result in everything being okay. Daniel Bias told the truth, and that results in his sitting in this courtroom. It was a terrible, horrible, tragic accident. It was not a crime, and I ask you to find Dan Bias not guilty.
I want you to hold this gun in your hand. And I want you to put it to your head. And I want you to stand up straight. And I want you to think about Lisa Bias. This is a very simple case. Did Lisa Bias want to commit suicide? Did she commit suicide? She couldn't have committed suicide. She couldn't have shot herself. It's impossible. It's physically impossible to shoot yourself with this gun from 6 inches away.
If you are not satisfied, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the defendant did, in fact, cause the victim's death, or that the defendant acted purposely or knowingly, then you must find the defendant not guilty of murder.